my name is Kanani Drummond, and today we'll be discussing Phillis Wheatley and her poems. So, Phillis Wheatley was actually the first African American to publish a book of poetry. She was captured when she was around 7 or 8 years old, and she was sold into slavery, where a family named the Wheatleys bought her. They named her Phillis because that was the name of the boat that she was on when they bought her, and Wheatley because that's their last name, and it was common for masters to give their slaves their last name. She was lucky because the Wheatley family actually took the time to educate her. She knew how to read, write, she knew about Homer, Plato, all of these famous classical authors. She knew everything about them. She was totally and completely educated and literate. While living with the Wheatleys and serving for them, they discovered that she was super talented with poetry, and they decided that she could study. They encouraged her to continue and pursue her talent of poetry. And it ended up being great for her because one of her sons helped her get her book published in London. Our text includes a preface because Phillis Wheatley was such a good author, such a good poet. A lot of people questioned that an actual African American slave had written these works. And so she actually had to go to court. She had to go to court to testify that these were her actual poets, that she had written them, and that they were hers and only hers, and that no one helped her or anything like that. And so because of this, the bottom, there's people who are saying that yes, they believe that she and only her are the author of these poems. So because people did not believe her, she always had to make sure that she was writing poems in classical form, using classical techniques, classical language, because in the 18th century, the highest form of artistic expression was poetry written utilizing classical techniques. So she made sure to use that to prove that she was educated, to prove that she was smart, that she was an African American slave who knew these things, was educated in the things, and could demonstrate these things. So this is where politics come in, because back then there was a diversion between people who were slavery supporters and then anti-slavery supporters. And so the main argument for the slavery supporters was that African American slaves were basically brain dead. They had the brain of a domesticated animal. That's what they compared them to. So basically they had no intelligence, they had no concept of feelings, emotions, none of that. And so the Wheatley family took Phillis Wheatley and said, well, here's our educated slave, like we should get her out to the world. And that is exactly what she did. She basically went on like a little book tour, and through this tour they were able to support anti-slaverist movements, that they were not in fact brain dead, they were not in fact the equivalent of a domestic animal, and that they were not in fact incapable of feeling emotions. Because here's Phillis Wheatley, a very talented, educated woman who also happens to be an African American slave. So the first poem I would like to discuss is On Virtue. It's the first poem that appears in our text. It is a 2-stanza poem, and it does not possess a consistent rhyme scheme, unlike the majority of her other poems. But it does, however, possess a couplet at the end of the second stanza. Raised as a Puritan, Wheatley believed virtue was essentially the way to ensure a soul's entry into heaven. So in her poem, she personifies virtue into her own soul. She demands her soul not to sink into despair, because virtue, an auspicious queen, as she personifies it, is there with her gentle hand to embrace and comfort her soul, ensuring chastity. She writes of seeking and courting virtue for her promised bliss. She asks virtue to guide her through her youthful years, resisting temptation and instead directing her to the path that results in endless life and bliss. Unsure whether to call virtue greatness, goodness, or an even higher title, she asks virtue, whom is enthroned by cherubs, to keep her chaste through teaching a better strain in a noble way. So this poem really highlights her religious feelings. She's very much a Puritan, she's very much religious, and she got that specifically from the Wheatley families, because if you go into her next poem, On Being Brought from Africa to America, she talks specifically about why she feels lucky that she became a slave to the Wheatleys. She claims mercy brought her from her pagan land. Before America, she had no idea about any of these religious beliefs, and she had no part in it. She claims mercy brought her from her pagan land because now, as a slave to the Wheatley family, her benighted soul has learned that there's a God and there's a Savior too. She says that before being a slave, she never knew redemption existed, so she never fought for it. She then speaks up for African Americans, reminding those that view her sable race with scornful eyes. She says to these people that just like Phillis Wheatley herself, they may be refined and join others as angels. And so she's basically arguing in a way to all these supporters of slavery, these people who are racist, that they're also a person, they can also be saved by God. Speaking of how she supports other African American slaves, she wrote a letter addressed to SM, a young African painter. SM is an abbreviation for Scipio Moorhead, an artist responsible for the engraving on Wheatley on her volume of poetry. She writes about how his artwork gives her soul delight because of how much life he gives them. She then speaks of her and SM pursuing nobler paths because she feels connected to him since they are both not only artists but they are also slaves. So she has this connection to him and she wants him to go along with her essentially to this nobler path, which is finding heaven. She brings up deathless glories as a reminder that beyond creating art, both must also focus on leaving behind a legacy. Along with endless fame, such as a legacy, she also aspires to gain entrance to heaven, because heaven is really the only place where they can truly experience freedom as slaves. She concludes that in the afterlife, their creative works will focus on nobler themes and pure language instead of these worldly happenings that are going on in her time. So this poem really just exemplifies how she relates with not only other artists, but especially other slavery artists, and how she does have a desire for freedom. She understands the concept that there really isn't freedom for her still, especially in a racist century like that. So as stated before, many of her poems are very religious, and another poem of hers that really exemplifies how she viewed religion and how important it was for her is her poem on the death of a young lady. This poem is 3 stanzas made with couplets. She writes of a young girl dying and entering heaven where she feels the iron hand of pain no more. She urges the parent to turn their sorrows into grateful praise. So instead of these parents mourning the loss of their daughter, she's like, why are you sad? Like, your daughter just went to heaven. She doesn't have to feel pain anymore. Which really, really highlights her belief in Puritanism. She believes in heaven, and she believes that now she'll no longer be suffering in this dark world. She says, the young girl is perfect in bliss in her heavenly home, just waiting for parents to join her, so there's no reason to grieve. She advises for hope of seeing their daughter in heaven to control their grief, and to adore the God who gives and takes away, and upright their actions so God will allow them entrance to heaven as well. Especially in this summarization, when she talks about the parents uprighting their actions, it was very important to the Puritans to seek salvation, to seek redemption, because Puritans believed in predestination, and really the only way that you can ensure that you made it to heaven was to always do good, to always make sure your actions were nothing but good, to ensure you had virtue and chastity, because otherwise your chances of getting into heaven were slim to none, because in the first place, God predestines people. The last poem I would like to discuss has to do more with how she met a lot of famous people and how that really impacted the anti-slavery movement, because like I said earlier, there was some politics behind her poems being published. And this poem is actually addressed to George Washington. So this poem was sent before America declared independence in 1776. George Washington was just recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Armies of North America. And when she sent this poem, the outcome of the war was still uncertain, and Britain was favored in winning. The central theme of this poem revolves around freedom's cause, considering colonists desired severing ties with England. She describes America as righteous for defending itself against England, although heaven looks down with sorrow. She then says the goddess is freedom, and she joins the war because she's there to bring about peace and crown America victorious. She also states that the location of the soldiers serves as a great advantage because Britain must cross a wild uproar of storms and winds that she compares to Aeolus, the king of winds, when he is angry. She says, America demands grace, glory from Washington, first in peace and honors. She states that the nation hopes for America to prevail and that virtue is on his side, and Washington can be guided by the goddess of freedom. She will crown America victorious. And so you'll see that George Washington did actually get back to her, and he was very much tickled pink, if you would. So this concludes my presentation. I hope if you take anything away from this, it's that Phillis Wheatley was an amazing African-American poet, and although it might have been luck that she was purchased by a family who so graciously educated her, she was also very knowledgeable and very talented in what she did. And that I would like to end this presentation. Thank you for your time.